Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode focusing on the failure to prevent fraud, which will come into effect live on September 1, 2025. Today, I'm visiting with Jonathan Armstrong. Jonathan, first of all, welcome to the pod.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks for the invite.
So, Jonathan, I recognize that the Economic Crimes Act is not your primary focus, but I thought it might be interesting to visit with you about what you see in this act or this new update to the law and how it may tie into other areas of UK law generally going forward. But before we get started, could you tell our audience where you work and what's the nature of your practice today?
Yeah, I'm at Punter Southall Law. I have a sort of technology and compliance focused practice that has included fraud investigations. We did a big fraud investigation for a client last year, and a focus looking at compliance often for US corporations in their global operations.
Jonathan, the first time I reviewed this new law, my first thought was all of this was illegal anyway. What's the big deal? Why are people talking about this? Or is this just a codification of basically common law fraud, or have I missed the boat?
I don't think you've missed the boat, and I think it's right to say that fraud has been illegal in the UK since time immemorial, since at least 1086, if you're a legal scholar, and possibly and probably earlier still, even under the Roman occupation. But what this act is trying to do is, is in some respects make it easier for prosecutors to prosecute corporations when they've been involved in fraud. We've had all sorts of discussions about things, technical legal terms like scienter, and who within the company knew stuff. And the aim of this is, I think, in some respects, to mirror the changes in bribery law, which again you could argue has been an offence in UK law since time immemorial, first codified into statute in the 1800s. So there are some similarities there. And the intention of the government is to change the discussion around fraud in much the same way as the discussion around bribery changed when the failure to prevent offence was introduced into the Bribery Act. And there's been a sort of push for this failure to prevent fraud offence for a considerable time, again, based on the premise that it's worked in the bribery area. At the same time, I think there's a couple of other circumstantial things that make it of interest. First of all, we've got a relatively new administration. The Starmer government seems more focused on corporate crime than predecessors. You could speculate as to the reasons for that, and maybe we won't dabble in politics, but there certainly is a willingness to look more at these type of issues. And of course, Starmer was himself a former Crown prosecutor. And the other circumstantial thing that makes this interesting, I think, is the relatively new director of the Serious Fraud Office, Nick Fgrave. He's been in post since September 2023, but he's certainly changed the SFO around a bit. They've become, I think, more focused. They've done more things like dawn raids. Fgrave is a policeman, not a lawyer, which is a sort of first for the SFO. And you've certainly seen that as a hallmark of his reign. So some good old fashioned policing, as I've said, things like dawn raids, an intent to bring cases to court more quickly, reduce staff turnover, increased morale, etc., etc. And that in turn has led to increased funding. So I think even if there were no substantial legal changes, we take things like this seriously for those reasons. But I think it's wrong to call it a reversed burden of proof, but let's use that as a sort of as a summary. The fact that corporations if there is a fraud offence, will in many cases be obliged to say what they did to try and prevent it, I think is intended to change the discussion around fraud. And it certainly has helped shine the light on fraud and make some organizations look at the steps that they have in place to prevent it.
Jonathan, what do you see as some of the key legal points in the new law?
I think the main thing I think is going to be this new offence. So effectively, if an associated person commits an offence intending to directly or indirectly benefit the organisation or its clients, then this new offence can be committed. So let's just unpack that slightly. Who's an associated person? Similar again to the Bribery Act. So it's going to be employees, agents, could potentially be people in your supply chain, etc., etc. They don't have to be based in the same country as you. And in fact, in the bribery cases that we've seen, it's quite often those with extended supply chains, extended sales chains that have been the most vulnerable. There is a defense to that offense, either if you had reasonable procedures in place or if it was unreasonable to expect fraud prevention measures to be in place. And again, broadly similar to the Bribery Act. And again, we've had some judicial guidance on both of those things. It's going to be pretty rare that you'll get an organization where they're going to say it's unreasonable to expect fraud prevention measures. Why that's going to be rare is these provisions apply to larger corporations. So that's defined in the Act as any corporation that satisfies two out of three or more, obviously all three you're in, of the following criteria. First of all, do they employ more than 250 employees? Secondly, do they have a turnover or gross revenue, you might call it in the US, of more than 36 million sterling? And thirdly, do they have more than 18 million sterling in total assets? So if you can tick two of those three boxes, then you're in the legislation. And as a result, I think it's going to be relatively rare that a judge will say, yep, you've got 250 employees. Yeah, you've got 36 million pounds in annualized revenue, but you didn't have to do anything else. So I think that second limb of the defense is going to be only very rarely used. So for organizations, it's putting the spotlight not only on them, but also on the people that they use to do business with. And I think that there are all sorts of climactic reasons why fraud has become more prevalent in organizations. And the intention here is, as I say, to shift focus and make organizations more responsible for policing those they do business with.
Jonathan, as I grew up practicing law in and around the energy industry, and I worked for US energy companies, all of whom had UK subsidiaries. One of the world's biggest and most well known energy companies is, of course, British Petroleum or BP, a UK company, but with a US subsidiary. Could you maybe explain, particularly for the US audience, what the jurisdiction will be for this law? So, is my Halliburton subsidiary, Halliburton UK, covered by this law? And is BP USA covered by this law?
It likely is. There's some complexity around UK nexus for frauds committed. It's again similar but not identical to the Bribery Act. So it's looking at things like where the subsidiary might be based, where the fraud took place, etc., etc. So it can be quite complex in certain circumstances. But if I'm a member of if I'm the general counsel of an organization like BP or Halliburton, the wise thing to do is to assume that the law is going to apply to all of your operations in all circumstances, because it's very hard to treat different subsidiaries or different transactions in different ways, particularly when the aim is to stamp out fraud. Not a lot of organizations want to condone fraud. Some do, because they turn a blind eye to dodgy deals to increase revenue, particularly when times are hard. But in the main, most organizations with some connection with the UK are going to want to look at these provisions and consider whether they apply to them. And obviously, the guidance is clear that an associated person can include a subsidiary entity. So if you are, for example, a UK headquartered entity, you can't just say, my subsidiaries do business in Angola, it's nothing to do with me, because the Angolan subsidiary in that circumstance can be an associated person of the parent company as well.
Jonathan, one of the things that I am either intrigued, confused, or maybe both about this law is who's the victim under this law? Because typically, if a corporation has fraud committed against it, i.e., employee Tom Fox, they say employee Tom Fox defrauded the corporation. He stole money in some nefarious manner, and Mr. Prosecutor, please prosecute Mr. Fox individually and try to get restitution. But this seems to be a little different. Now, if I've stolen enough money, perhaps shareholders will sue, saying there was no oversight of Tom Fox or insufficient fraud prevention. But how do we get to the corporation being the guilty party here if Tom Fox engaged in nefarious fraud activity?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's one that was front and center for a matter that I handled at the end of last year, where I won't go into any of the details, but effectively the corporation's revenue was increased as a result of the fraud. And you might well argue, is the corporation then a victim? It's banked extra revenue and it's banked extra profits. But I think quite often you have to look at these things holistically. Nearly always somebody somewhere is a victim and somebody somewhere loses out. Now, that might be, for example, let's say, in the construction space where false invoices are being created to give, I don't know, kickbacks to a purchasing manager, for example. Then in that case, then it might be the corporation who's paying out the inflated price that's victim. In other cases, it might be society at large, with health contracts, for example, in the UK, which are a current area of focus, where it is said that fraudulent transactions for PPE, for example, increased the cost of healthcare during COVID or decreased the money available for other COVID care systems. So I think in many circumstances, it's going to turn on its own facts, isn't it? And it's quite often not as easy as you first think to identify who the victim is, nor is it as easy as you might first think to look at intention as well. So, what did the individual intend to do by his actions? And again, that's where proper investigations will become key to look at whether there is a offence that comes under the Act at all. So, we're going to need to look at things like whistleblowing reports. We're going to need to look at that whole way in which we treat whistleblowers when allegations of fraud are involved to enable us to look at those type of issues more quickly to see whether we have a problem at all, and if so, how big a problem that might be.
Jonathan, does this new law put more ammunition in the prosecutor's bag, or as we might say, more arrows in their quiver to use?
I think it definitely does. I think it will help them. I think it also helps. Fraud is an evolving beast, I think, really. I know people traditionally look at the fraud triangle and things like that, but there are undoubtedly added pressures, some of which have arrived post the pandemic and people working from home or having hybrid working. One of those factors is technology. It is easier to fake documents now than it ever has been. You can say to a Gen AI application, create me something that looks like an invoice from Corporation A to Corporation B and include the logo of Corporation A. So it can be as easy as saying the words to create fake documentation. There are less people in an organization, from my experience, doing the checks and balances that they need to. Opportunity is greater with things like working from home and hybrid working. Those people who are committing fraud often will construct an environment where nobody is looking over their shoulder so that they're free to do stuff maybe from their home office, take time, commit the fraud, create the documents that back it all up. Many organizations are downsizing. They're downsizing not only frontline teams, sales teams, but also compliance people who are doing the checks and balances in the CFO's team or whatever. So that's a real worry as well. And then I think there's also greater pressure on corporations. Obviously, people are trying to hit numbers. Obviously, many organizations are having a number of tough quarters, one after the other. Shareholder pressure hasn't relented. But those organizations owned by private equity might be under particular pressure as well, because that IPO flow has gone out of the market in the short term, and a lot of private equity investors that have held on to assets for longer than they expected are trying to ramp profits up, in part to pay debt, in part to pay them back. And I think there's also an increase in rationalization as well. There are surveys on the attitude of those newer to the workforce, their willingness to break policies to get the job done. And in some cases, it's easy to rationalize fraud. Some organizations will think, if I did the deal legitimately, then the risk team would knock it back. So let me just create a few extra documents to do a deal that we need to do, and the pen pushers won't be upset by any of this, so they won't know, and we'll get the deal through smoothly, and we've got a willing buyer and a willing seller, and everyone's happy. So there's quite a lot of rationalization around that. Again, particularly in a world where bonuses aren't as generous as they might have been in many industries, again, because of the downturn. Some people are thinking, but I'll push this deal through because I still deserve to go to the top 100 event in Nevada at the company's expense, or I deserve my bonus for all the hard work I've put in, etc., etc. So I think you can never look at fraud in isolation. I think you also always have to look at the climate around you. And I think for that reason, it's important that corporations acknowledge that circumstances might be different from when they last did a fraud risk assessment. And things like the new legislation make it more challenging if you don't get it right.
I was going to ask you a question, but actually you portended my question in your last answer, which is the fraud risk assessment. And the question is going to be, where do we start? If you get a phone call in and say, Jonathan, we're now aware of this new law, where do we start? So how would you counsel a company on starting and then following through with a process to put the plan in place that would satisfy the requirements of the new law?
I think a decent first start is the principles that are in the Act. You could do an assessment against what you have already and a gap analysis against what you need using those 6 principles. So the first principle is top level commitment. Is your board committed to this? Does your board have the skills to recognize fraud risk? Now, most boards, from my experience, probably do. This isn't an area where there are lots of board deficiencies like AI, cybersecurity. Most boards have somebody with audit experience, and you need to filter that top level commitment down. But that needs to be real. That needs to be not pretend. I know, Tom, I've used the example before of a client who made a training video on compliance introduced by their CEO, where the CEO said, "This matters to me, I feel it in my heart." The only bad thing about that is when you studied the film, as I was asked to before it was released, you could see a reflection and you could see one of his team holding up a card that included the words, "I feel it in my heart," open square brackets, "pat your heart," close square brackets. So much less sincere when you see the instructions that the CEO has to feel it, has to be authentic, and he has to tell the team that doing the right thing is important and can be more important than hitting your numbers. I think also included in that, you'll need to look at things like remuneration. So you get what you reward. So what are you paying? Secondly, I think you're going to look at a risk assessment. That's going to involve not only the sort of risks at an operational level, but also what are the potential failures in the checks and balances. So that might be working with internal audit, it might be working with the CFO's team, it might be looking at how third parties, associated persons are originated on systems. Thirdly, the measures say you should look at risk-based prevention. So that's obviously doing that analysis of what are our risks, how can we mitigate them. Fourthly, it's looking at due diligence on associated persons. So where do we get these people from? Do they exist? Are they legit? Have they been trained in fraud risk? Have they been involved in any episodes in the past? And obviously, that due diligence effort will increase in high risk jurisdictions or high risk industries, or places like procurement where there seems to be a rapid turnover of individuals. Fifthly, you'll have to look at communication and training. That's fifth in the list. I don't think that's fifth in terms of priority. I think oftentimes telling individuals about the risks, telling them not to do bad things, making authentic training that isn't just a check the box exercise, isn't just some dull online session where people can multitask and get their emails cleared down whilst pretending to listen. It has to be clear and authentic. And regulators are very much into looking at the quality of the training, not just the quantity. And we know that repeated, small, micro messaging works to change behaviors. You're going to have to look at things like that. And then sixthly, that whole monitoring and review piece. If you get a whistleblower report, have you got the processes in place to deal with it? Have you got the team in place to deal with it? How do you deal with privilege? How do you conduct a defensible investigation? Increasingly, in areas of digital fraud, including some of the work I've been dealing with in the last 12 months, things like metadata is really important. A lot of the boring stuff that we tend to disregard can be key in fraud investigations. Who created the document? On what device? When did they create it? Which tools did they use? If it's on somebody's iPhone at 11 o'clock at night and they've used fakemyinvoice.com app to create the tool, then that tells you a story. If they've used the company's legitimate software and it's a legitimate time of day on their work laptop, then that tells you a different story. So things like forensically obtaining evidence will be really key as well. There's a relatively limited number of people who can gather data in a forensically defensible way. Quite often, people within an organization, somebody will hold their hand up in the CISO's team or the IT team and say, I can do it, I can do it, I'll have a go. But they might not be the right person, and they might not be the right person to give evidence in court as to the way in which that data was collected and analyzed if it comes to that. So things like the monitoring and review process are very important, and the investigation piece will need to be tailored to the allegations that are being made in a particular circumstance. And as I say, that might need to be a much more tech savvy investigation than even 5 years ago, just because of the prevalence of tools available to fake things. And then maybe one other thing I'd say is that the actual scope of fraud is increasing as well. For example, last week I spoke at a conference on some of the technology aspects of ESG fraud. And ESG fraud is definitely on the rise, and many organizations feel under pressure to say stuff about how they're helping the environment. Some corporations have built their whole business on things like saying that the vehicles they produce are kinder to the environment, when some of those statements are fraud, plain and simple. Unless you can prove that you've bettered the environment, unless you can, if you're trading emissions credits, for example, on the back end of your business, but claiming green credentials on the front end, then they're things that could lead to suspicions of fraud in an organization. As well as looking at new ways to commit fraud, we have to look at new areas in which fraud exists. And so that's why it's really important, I think, to do that whole risk assessment piece and look at today's risks, not yesterday's.
So that greenwashing, AI washing, peanut butter washing, coffee washing, Brazilian coffee washing could all, at least theoretically, fall under this act with appropriate jurisdiction.
Yes, they could. Yeah. And my experience is that organizations perhaps aren't as tuned into those newer risks, the whole ESG piece. They're not as tuned in as they should be. And these claims are harder to justify, I think, particularly vague claims like this is kinder to the planet or AI does this 10 times faster. Those claims, just like any other, have to be forensically examined. And if you've misled people, customers or shareholders, then they're under the scope of this legislation just as any other type of fraud. And indeed, the SFO has already been looking at green fraud in an investigation into jungle-related investment projects.
Jonathan, I'd like to end by getting your assessment of the likely impact on this law on, frankly, non-UK companies, because this podcast primarily has a US audience. And you've mentioned it a couple of times about companies, but could you maybe end by giving your thoughts on why US or other EU companies need to pay attention to this law?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think I've seen quite a lot of commentators say this is as major for fraud as the Bribery Act was for bribery, and it's going to have a similar effect all over the world. I'm not convinced of that. I think the Bribery Act was a turning point that was significant, not just in the UK, but globally. I'm not sure it will have exactly the same impact, but I think it is being closely watched. I know I've taken trips up to Scandinavia, to Germany, to Austria in the last couple of weeks, and I know that other jurisdictions are looking at this. I know that they're looking at measures in which they can prevent fraud as well. And if this makes a difference, then this law will be mirrored in other jurisdictions. I also sense that there is a willingness of the UK to get involved, as I said, in part because of the new administration, in part because of a different sense of proportion of priorities at the SFO. So I think it's definitely something to address. And the honest answer is for most organizations, if you say to them, do you condone fraud within your organization? They say, well, of course not. This is something that we all really agree on. We all want to stop fraud in our organizations. And so you can easily develop a program that echoes the corporation's moral code of not committing fraud and also meets the additional legal obligations that they're under.
Jonathan, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our audience wanted to connect with you, find out more about your practice or your firm, what might be the best place or places for them to go?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, or they can also email jonathan.armstrong@puntersouthall.law. They can look on the Punter Southall Law website. If you search Punter Southall Insights Fraud, you'd get some FAQs that we've produced on the new legislation, and you'd also get an alert that we've written for clients on some other changes at the SFO in terms of guidance on self-reporting, etc.
We're going to link to all of those in the show notes for any of our listeners who wanted to follow up. Jonathan, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
My pleasure, Tom. Be well.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.